Some stories refuse to stay buried. Some truths, no matter how tightly a society tries to lock them away, keep whispering through the cracks of time, insisting that someone, someday, will finally stop long enough to listen. And tonight, I want to take you somewhere. Not just to a place on a map, but into a silence that lasted centuries. Into a silence built by fear, protected by power, and carried from one generation to the next like a shadow that no one dared to turn and face. Because there is a story in the history of Charleston that most people have never heard, not because it was small, not because it was insignificant, but because it was uncomfortable. Because it was inconvenient. Because it revealed something about human nature, human cruelty, and human resilience that our city, our nation, and maybe even our churches would rather not dwell on. It is the story of a pregnant enslaved woman whose existence, whose condition, whose very presence, has puzzled historians and haunted archives, whispered about yet never fully explained. A story that sits at the intersection of faith and hypocrisy, power and suffering, silence and truth. A story that has been footnoted, sidelined, and sanitized, until now. And I want you to imagine the scene with me, not to sensationalize it, but to understand the weight of it. Picture Charleston long before the bustling streets, the pastel houses, the charm that tourists photograph. Picture a port city built not on beauty, but on bondage. Where the air was thick with humidity and the sound of chains was part of the daily rhythm. Where markets weren't filled with goods alone, but with people. Where a woman could be carrying a life inside her and still be considered someone's property. And yet, in that world, harsh, controlled, and unforgiving, this woman's story slipped through the grip of those who tried to erase her. And the strange thing is, no one has ever explained why. No one has ever fully explained her. Her existence appears in fragments. A trial record here, a church ledger there, whispered testimony in a dusty archive, a mention in a planter's diary, a note written in margins as if the writer himself didn't want to admit the truth of what he had witnessed. She appears and disappears like a ghost moving between the lines of Charleston's history. Pregnant, enslaved, unnamed, and somehow, central to a secret no one wanted to unearth. When I first encountered this story, I felt something shift inside me. You know that feeling, when you stumble on something so heavy, so strange, so unresolved that it almost feels like it belongs to another world. And yet it is ours. It is our soil, our history, our inheritance. And as I sat with those fragments, I realized, this wasn't just about a pregnant enslaved woman. This was about what her story exposes about all of us. About what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. About the truth that lives beneath the stories we've been told. About the faith we claim and the lives we overlook. Because Charleston has many stories, grand ones, famous ones, but this story is different. It sits at the edge of the city's conscience like a question that no one wanted to answer. A question about how a woman could carry life when her life was not her own. About how a city could preach the gospel on Sunday while enslaving the image of God on Monday. About how a secret could be so unsettling that it was easier to pretend it never existed. But secrets have a way of waiting. They have patience. And sometimes, God has a way of taking what was hidden, what was dismissed, what was buried, and placing it right back in front of us, saying, "What will you do with this now?" I imagine this woman. Let's just call her the woman, because history didn't bother to keep her name, standing in the heat of a Charleston morning. Maybe near Broad Street, maybe on a plantation just outside the city limits, maybe in a holding pen near the market, her hands resting on her belly, the child inside her growing in a world that never intended to welcome either of them. And the people around her whispering, "Who is the father? How did this happen? Why does her story not add up? Why does something feel wrong?" Rumors, doubts, fear, threats, and above it all, a strange, persistent silence. A silence that feels less like ignorance and more like deliberate refusal. Because when something is too uncomfortable, too revealing, too indicting, we learn to look away. But here's the thing. God never looks away from any of his children. Not the ones history celebrates. Not the ones history forgets. Not the ones the world tries to silence. And certainly not the ones who suffered under systems that claim to be righteous while doing unrighteous things. And the more I leaned into her story, the scraps of it, the contradictions in it, the questions that hover around it, the more I realize that what makes it so bizarre is not her. It is us. It is the way people in power responded to her presence. The way they scrambled to explain the unexplainable. The way the city reacted as if her pregnancy was not merely a personal condition but a political, moral, and spiritual crisis. Because something about her situation exposed a truth the city was not prepared to acknowledge. You see, sometimes the people with the most power fear the truth the most. Because the truth is unpredictable. The truth is inconvenient. The truth sets people free, but it also confronts the systems built to keep people bound. And I want you to feel this tonight, not as distant history, but as a mirror. Because you and I are not just here to hear a story. We are here to understand why this story was hidden. Why it mattered. Why it still matters. Why it still speaks. Because if a city as prominent as Charleston could bury a story like this, what else have we buried? If a woman so central to exposing injustice could be silenced, who else have we silenced? If the pain of one mother could be erased so easily, how many other lives have been brushed aside because they didn't fit the version of history someone wanted to tell? And let me tell you, this is not just a historical exploration. This is a spiritual one. Because every time we avoid uncomfortable truth, it doesn't just stay in the past, it grows roots in the present. It shapes our culture, our morality, our theology, our understanding of justice, mercy, and humanity. And the cost of that silence is far greater than we ever admit. So tonight, I'm inviting you, not into a scandal, not into a sensational mystery, but into a confrontation with truth. Into the kind of truth that makes you shift in your seat. The kind of truth that demands you pause. The kind of truth that whispers, you are inheriting a story, whether you acknowledge it or not. Imagine again that woman standing there, pregnant, enslaved, silent. But not invisible, never invisible, not to God, not to the truth, not to history, no matter how hard it tried to hide her. And I wonder, if she could speak to us now, what would she say? Would she tell us how she became the epicenter of a whispered scandal? Would she tell us why the people around her seemed terrified of the truth her body carried? Would she tell us about the father of that child? About the fear that wrapped itself around her every movement? About the prayers she whispered, not knowing if hope was even permitted for someone like her? Or would she tell us something even deeper, something about how systems of oppression are always terrified of what they can't fully control? Terrified of the truth that human life persists, even in bondage. Terrified of the God who breathes dignity into every soul, even when society does not. And church, let me tell you something. When you touch a story like this, you touch a wound. And wounds don't heal by ignoring them. They don't heal by rewriting history. They don't heal by pretending they never existed. Wounds heal when truth enters. When light enters. When we finally muster the courage to say, we will not look away anymore. And that is why this story matters. Not because it is bizarre. Not because it is secret. But because it reveals the spiritual and moral contradictions that lie at the heart of so much of our history. Because it forces us to take seriously the lives that systems tried to erase. Because it reminds us that the measure of a society, and the measure of a church, is not how it treats the powerful, but how it treats the vulnerable. The silenced, the forgotten. And as we unravel this story tonight, I want you to carry one question with you. What truth have we inherited that we have not yet dared to face? Because the woman in Charleston's history, the pregnant enslaved woman whose story no one ever explained, was not a footnote. She was a revelation, a living contradiction to the lies people told to justify cruelty. A reminder that humanity cannot be erased, even when laws try to erase it. A symbol of a truth larger than any system that tried to suppress it. And tonight, we let her speak. Through the fragments, through the echoes, through the silence that could not bury her forever. Because some stories refuse to die until justice hears them.